Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight, we step beyond the heroic sagas and into what followed the raids, when Saxon noblewomen vanished from records and were rarely spoken of again. Why do noble bloodlines abruptly collapse after raids? The sources speak clearly about ransom and slaves. They are vague about noblewomen, high-born captives whose names dissolve after the raid. You stand inside a Saxon hall at dawn. The smoke has thinned, but it still stings your eyes. What remains is breath and fear. Let the noise of your day fade. If these stories matter to you, consider liking and subscribing. You're safe here. It's the late 9th century. A Saxon kingdom bleeds quietly after the ships are gone. The screaming stopped 3 hours ago, but the silence is worse. The year is 867 of the Common Era, the 9th day after the Great Heathen Army captured the city of York. And the woman crouched in the corner of what was once a church has been listening to that silence for long enough to understand what it means. Her name is Ailifu of North Umbria. She is 29 years old. She was, until 9 days ago, the wife of a thing whose land stretched from the river to the edge of the great forest. A noble woman whose household included 30 servants, whose marriage portion included gold and silver, worth more than most villages produced in a decade, whose children were being educated by monks who came specifically to her hall to teach them Latin and scripture. Her children are dead, her husband is dead, her servants are dead or scattered or taken. Everything she built across 12 years of marriage exists now only in her memory. And even that is fragmenting under the weight of what she has witnessed over the past 9 days. She can smell the smoke that still rises from the burned quarters of the city, can smell the blood that has soaked into the stone floor of this church, where the Northmen have gathered their captives, can smell the unwashed bodies of the 43 women who share this space with her noblewomen, merchants' wives, the daughters of craftsmen, anyone the raiders considered valuable enough to keep alive. The occasional scream that suggests the processing of captives is not yet complete. The rhythmic chanting that she has learned accompanies certain rituals the raiders perform, and she can see through the broken doorway of the church the berserkers. No, they are not like the other Northmen. The berserkers are different. They wear the skins of wolves and bears. They bite their shields and howl before battle. They seem to feel no pain when wounded, and what they do to captives after the fighting ends follows no logic that Ailgifu can understand. One of them is walking toward the church now. His name, she will later learn, is Sigurd the Red, called that for reasons that have nothing to do with his hair. He has killed 14 men in the taking of York. He has been promised first selection from the noble captives as reward for his service in the assault on the city walls. He is walking toward the church where Alfgu is chained, and the other captives are pressing back against the walls, and the silence that replaced the screaming 3 hours ago is about to end. What happens next? This is what the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the Irish annals, and the Scandinavian sagas themselves document about what happened to captive women after the raids practices so extreme that medieval chroniclers, who were not squeamish about violence, described them in terms suggesting they exceeded anything else in their experience. The berserkers occupy a unique position in Viking military culture, elite warriors whose battlefield behavior was so extreme that even other Vikings regarded them with a mixture of awe and fear. The word itself comes from the Old Norse, meaning either bear shirt or bear shirt, depending on interpretation, and both meanings capture something true about these warriors. They went into battle in altered states of consciousness that the sagas describe as berserker ganga, the berserker fury. In this state, according to sources ranging from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda to the Ynglinga saga, they howled like wolves, bit their shields, felt no pain from wounds, and fought with a strength and ferocity that seemed superhuman to observers. They could not distinguish between friend and enemy. They attacked anything that moved, after the fury passed. Yes, they often collapsed into exhaustion so complete that they could not move for hours or even days. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the Berserker gang. Berserkers fought with exceptional violence. They inspired terror in enemies who believed they faced something more than human. And after battles ended, they did not simply return to normal behavior. A period during which berserkers were given access to captives and plunder as both reward and outlet for the aggression that continued after combat ended. They were not ordinary raiders whose treatment of captives followed ordinary patterns. The army was larger and better organized than typical raiding forces commanded by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, equipped for prolonged campaigning rather than quick strikes. The berserkers served as shock troops. The processing of captives after a Viking raid followed established protocols that the sources describe with sufficient consistency to reconstruct the standard sequence. The first stage was sorting. Captives were divided into categories based on their apparent value, nobility, and wealth indicated by clothing, jewelry, and bearing. Physical condition indicating capacity for labor or other service. Age indicating likely survival during transport and remaining years of useful life. Elfgifu was identified as a noble woman immediately. Her clothing, fine wool dyed with expensive colors, marked her status. Her jewelry, gold rings, silver brooches confirmed it. Her bearing the posture of someone accustomed to giving commands rather than receiving them made her category unmistakable. She was separated from common captives and placed with other noble women in the church that the Northmen had converted into a holding facility. The second stage was claiming. Elite warriors who had distinguished themselves in the fighting were given first access to high-value captives. This was not chaotic looting, but structured distribution. Commanders allocated captives based on assessed value, and warriors demonstrated merit. The most valuable captives went to the most important warriors. Berserkers, because of their exceptional combat role, were typically among the first to claim. Sigurd the Red had earned his claim through his role in the assault. His claim was acknowledged by the army's commanders, the sons of Ragnar themselves, had nodded when he stated which captive he wanted. He wanted the noble woman with the gold rings, or he wanted Alfgifu. The third stage was marking. Claimed captives were marked to indicate ownership, typically through collars, brands, or other physical indicators that would prevent disputes about who had claimed whom. The collar around Elfgifu's neck was already in place, generic marking indicating she was captive property of the army. What Sigurd did when he entered the church was replace that generic collar with one bearing his personal mark, a runic symbol that identified her as his specific property. The marking happened in front of the other captives. This was deliberate. The sources indicate that public marking served psychological purposes beyond simple identification. It demonstrated to all captives that they were property now, that their status had fundamentally changed, that the collars and chains were not temporary restraints, but permanent indicators of their new condition. Elfgifu did not resist when Sigurd removed the generic collar and replaced it with his own. She had seen what happened to captives who resisted. She had witnessed, during the 9 days since York's fall, exactly what the Northmen did to women who fought back. She stood still while the cold iron closed around her neck, while the runic mark of her new owner pressed against her throat, while the other captives watched and understood that what was happening to her would soon happen to them. The fourth stage was removal. Claimed captives were taken from the common holding area to wherever their new owner chose to keep them. For ordinary warriors, this might mean a tent in the army's camp. For elite warriors like Sigurd, it meant quarters appropriate to their status. In this case, in a stone building that had been a merchant's house before the assault, now serving as residence for one of the army's most valued berserkers. Sigurd did not speak to Ælfgifu as he led her through the streets of conquered York. He did not explain what was going to happen. He did not acknowledge her as a person capable of understanding or responding. He simply walked, holding the chain attached to her collar, and she followed because the alternative was being dragged. The building he brought her to smelled of blood and smoke and something else. The particular animal musk that she would learn to associate with berserkers, the scent of wolf and bear pelts that they wore as marks of their status. The interior was dark, lit only by a fire pit in the center of the single large room. As the walls were hung with weapons and trophies from previous raids, and in the corner, chained to an iron ring set into the stone wall, were two other women who had been claimed before her. The sources that document Viking treatment of captives are multiple and consistent in their general descriptions, though they vary in the level of detail they provide. The first night after claiming was when this breaking typically began. Ælfgifu spent her first night in Sigurd's quarters experiencing what the sources describe. The two women who had been claimed before her, one the merchant's wife, one the daughter of a craftsman, had already undergone their first nights. Their condition when Ælfgifu arrived suggested what she could expect. One of them would not meet her eyes. The other had not spoken since her capture, though Ælfgifu would later learn she had been articulate and witty before York fell. The sagas describe berserker treatment of thralls in terms that include physical domination, the use of restraints, and practices that the sources indicate were particularly associated with warriors who fought in altered states. By morning, Ælfgifu had experienced the beginning of what she would endure for the next 11 months. She had learned the first lesson that all claimed captives learned. Resistance produced additional suffering without changing outcomes. Compliance produced less suffering, but changed nothing about what was going to happen. The only variable she controlled was how much she suffered while the predetermined events occurred. She chose compliance. The two women chained beside her had already learned the same lesson. But the three of them began their lives as Sigurd's property, with the knowledge that their choices extended only to how they experienced what they could not prevent. The process had identifiable stages that the sources describe with varying levels of detail. The first stage was physical dominance, establishing through direct experience that the captor had absolute power over the captive's body. This stage typically occurred during the first days after claiming and included the practices documented in the sources already described. The purpose was not merely to inflict suffering, but to demonstrate that suffering could be inflicted at will, that the captive had no capacity to prevent or resist whatever the captor chose to do. The second stage was identity destruction, attacking the beliefs, relationships, and self-concepts that allowed the captive to maintain a stable sense of who she was. Captives were forbidden to use their former names. They were forbidden to speak of their former lives. They were punished for any behavior that suggested they considered themselves anything other than property. The purpose was to create psychological disorientation that made resistance more difficult and acceptance more likely. The third stage was conditioning, teaching the captive to respond to commands automatically, to anticipate the owner's desires, to behave in ways that demonstrated acceptance of her new status. This conditioning used methods that modern psychologists recognize as effective for creating compliance. Rewards for desired behavior, punishment for undesired behavior, are unpredictable alternation between kindness and cruelty that kept the captive focused on reading the owner's mood rather than on her own internal state. The fourth stage was testing, placing the captive in situations that would reveal whether the breaking had been successful. Could she be trusted with limited freedom without attempting escape? Could she perform assigned tasks without supervision? Could she interact with others in ways that demonstrated acceptance of her status? Captives who passed these tests moved toward final disposition. Captives who failed were subjected to additional breaking. Eilif Gifu experienced all 4 stages across the 11 months she spent as Sigurd's property. The physical dominance stage lasted approximately 2 weeks. During this time, Eilif Gifu was not permitted to leave Sigurd's quarters, and she was subjected to treatment that established beyond any doubt that her body was no longer her own, that what was done to it was determined entirely by Sigurd's will. The identity destruction stage overlapped with the physical dominance stage and continued for approximately 2 months. Eilif Gifu's name was replaced with a Norse term meaning the Saxon, a category rather than an identity. Her clothing was replaced with rough wool, marked with Sigurd's ownership symbol. Her jewelry was taken. Her hair was cut. Every visible marker of her former status was removed and replaced with markers of her new status. The conditioning stage continued throughout her captivity. She learned what pleased Sigurd and what angered him. She learned to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. She learned to make herself useful in ways that might lead to better treatment. The testing stage came approximately 4 months after her capture. Sigurd began taking her outside his quarters, displaying her in the camp, requiring her to perform tasks that involved limited, unsupervised movement. She did not attempt to escape. She had learned what happened to captives who attempted escape. She had watched one of the other women in Sigurd's quarters try to flee during the 2nd month, and had witnessed what was done to her when she was recaptured. By the time the Great Heathen Army moved on from York, Eilif Gifu had been broken in the technical sense the sources describe. She was not the same person she had been before the capture. Something fundamental had been destroyed or suppressed or transformed. What remained was capable of functioning as property, of performing the role that the breaking process was designed to create. Women whose outcomes were different from Eilif Gifu's reveal the range of what the thrall system produced. Our Ead was the daughter of an ealdorman, a nobleman of high rank in the Anglo-Saxon system, comparable to a count or earl in continental terminology. She was 19 years old when her father's estate was raided in approximately 871 during the Great Heathen Army's campaign through Mercia. She was captured along with her mother and 2 younger sisters during the assault that killed her father and most of his household warriors. The family's high status was immediately apparent to the raiders. Their clothing, their jewelry, their bearing, all indicated wealth and rank that would translate to high prices in the slave markets or high value as personal property. The 4 women were separated from common captives and held for distribution among the army's leadership. Ead was claimed by a berserker chieftain named Halfdan, was one of the commanders of the Great Heathen Army and reputedly a son of Ragnar Lothbrok himself. Ead became the property of one of the most powerful men in the invading force. Her mother and sisters were claimed by other warriors. The family was separated within hours of capture and would never be reunited. Ead would later learn that one sister died during transport to Scandinavia, that another sister was sold in the Dublin slave market to a buyer whose identity was not recorded, and that her mother survived approximately 3 years in captivity before dying of causes the sources do not specify. What made Ead's experience different from Eilif Gifu's was the status of her captor. Halfdan was not merely a successful warrior. He was royalty, by Viking standards, a commander of armies, and a man who would eventually become king of a portion of the territory his army conquered. His household was larger, more organized, more concerned with maintaining appearances appropriate to his rank. Ead was not kept in rough quarters, or subjected to the immediate breaking that ordinary captives experienced. She was placed in a household that included other high-status captives, attended by servants who were themselves thralls, treated in ways that recognized her value as a status symbol for her owner. She was still property, still subject to Halfdan's will in all things, but the expression of that ownership took different forms than it did for captives owned by ordinary warriors. She wore fine clothing, though marked with Halfdan's symbols. She ate well, though at his table and at his pleasure. and she was permitted to maintain certain dignities, though only those that her owner chose to permit. What the sources also make clear is that Aed adapted to her circumstances more successfully than many captives. She learned Norse quickly, becoming fluent within months. She made herself useful to Halfdan's household in ways that went beyond her value as property advising on Saxon customs, helping negotiate with English leaders, serving as translator in situations where such service was valuable. She became, in the terminology of the sources, a favored thrall property that had earned preferential treatment through demonstrated usefulness. When Halfdan was killed in battle in approximately 877, Eadburh's status became uncertain. Property of a dead man could be inherited, sold, or simply taken by whoever had power to claim it. The sources indicate that she was claimed by another member of Halfdan's faction, that she continued in similar conditions to those she had experienced before, and that she eventually died in Scandinavia at approximately 40 years of age, still enslaved, but having survived longer than most captives, and in conditions less brutal than most endured. Her story is not triumphant. 20 years of slavery, separation from family, death far from home. These are not elements of a happy ending, but she survived, she adapted, she found ways to make her captivity more bearable than it might have been. And her survival itself is a kind of testimony evidence that some captives found ways through the system that destroyed so many others. The night grows quieter now. The voices of the past begin to fade. Somewhere, far from the clash of shields, a fire crackles low against damp earth. Smoke drifts through a broken hall. What lingers is not the noise of conquest, but the silence that followed it. The silence carried by women whose names were never carved into stone. If this journey stayed with you, you may leave a quiet like behind. Or share this story with someone who listens to the past at night. And if you wish, you can subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, and we will meet again